The subject of today's lecture is culture shock, group pressure in action. I'm going to focus on three main ideas of this lecture. First of all, we will consider the reasons why people experience culture shock. Secondly, I will describe the different stages of the experience. And finally, I'll mention some possible applications of this research. First, then, why do people experience culture shock? Now let's turn to the different stages of culture shock. To conclude, let's look at some practical applications of the research. The subject of today's lecture is culture shock, group pressure in action. Culture shock, as you know, is a term used to describe the experience many people have when they travel to another country, and it can be seen as a manifestation of group pressure in action. It is a good example of group pressure because it shows what happens when an individual suddenly experiences different cultural rules, the rules of another cultural group. Now, culture shock is a complex phenomenon, but I'm going to focus on three main ideas of this lecture. First of all, we will consider the reasons why people experience culture shock. Secondly, I will describe the different stages of the experience. And finally, I'll mention some possible applications of this research. Because although you might think that culture shock affects, say, only travelers, that is not the case. In fact, cross-cultural studies have immense practical value for modern society. First, then, why do people experience culture shock? Think about this for a minute. When you grow up in a particular set of surroundings, naturally, you get used to the rules and guidelines that govern the behavior of the people around you. In a sense, you become totally dependent on the rules of your social group. You tend not to question them, you just accept them without thinking. Now, these rules are often not clearly articulated, and therefore, you're not aware of their impact. In other words, you are not necessarily conscious of them. They only become important when, for example, you go to another country or a different environment that's governed by a different set of rules. In fact, this experience can be so shocking that it has been compared to having a bucket of cold water thrown over you. Now, culture shock happens precisely because you cannot use your own culture as a map to guide your own behavior and your own understanding of what surrounds you. You're totally out of control, just as if you were driving along a highway in the dark without a road map. And because of this, people often behave irrationally. It's a highly stressful experience, and there are different symptoms in different stages. Now let's turn to the different stages of culture shock. Most researchers agree that there are three main stages. If you were to depict it on paper, you might draw a wave shape. The first stage, the crest, or highest part of the wave, is often referred to as the honeymoon stage. It's the time when you first arrive in a new culture and are confronted with a whole set of different rules. What are the emotions that you experience during this time? Even though this is a new and often strange experience, people don't usually react with fear. Surprisingly, there is often a feeling of euphoria. The most common reactions at this time are excitement, fascination, and enthusiasm. Of course, you're on your guard because of the strangeness of the situation. But at this stage, cultural differences are likely to seem exciting rather than threatening. The second stage has been called the letdown. Here are some feelings that people experience during this phase. Irritation, hostility, and confusion. They might also feel exhausted, lonely, and nervous. Now, these feelings happen because travelers and others have to unlearn their own cultural habits and values as they spend more time in a new country and are expected to function according to the ways of that place. They excuse me, they may feel like lost children without protection. They probably want to go home, but if they can't do that, they spend a lot of time with other people from their own country in order to get back a sense of safety. Now, the final stage is one of resignation. Even if visitors aren't completely comfortable, they do become adjusted to the new environment, or at least they stop feeling that they need to defend their own culture every time they encounter a habit or value they don't easily recognize. They might never recapture the honeymoon period, but they're not as depressed as they were during stage 2. To conclude, let's look at some practical applications of the research. Well, remember I mentioned that it doesn't just apply to tourists on vacation or even international students. In our world of rapid transportation and population mobility, many societies have recent immigrants, sometimes in large numbers. This becomes a general social challenge because immigrants are going through even more cultural shock than tourists. Furthermore, older residents of a country with large numbers of new immigrants can experience their own form of internal culture shock when they see neighborhoods or even large regions where people speak a foreign language or eat unfamiliar food or behave according to cultural patterns brought from their own countries. Now, because cultural differences can sometimes lead to tense relationships between different ethnic groups, it is vital that people try to learn as much as possible. Get some cross-cultural training, if they can, about the different cultures in their own societies. Because the more we learn about our differences, the easier it is to live in a world where different cultures have to live in close contact with each other.